Good morning, Mr. Benjamin. Good morning, Mr. Nicholas. What are you doing calling me Benjamin? Only my mother
And
calls me Benjamin.
hello to bowerbirders out there listening at
Hello,
home.
everyone. Everyone's a bowerbirder. We should mention that, actually. We always address everyone as bowerbirder.
Internally, we have bowerbirders,
Yes.
the people who work at bowerbird, and then we have the people who use bowerbird, which are bowerbirders. But somehow the inflection changes who we're talking about.
Yeah, like if we say bowerbirders, they know that it's internal because they're getting in trouble for something.
Yeah, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, it came from a LinkedIn post that you put out asking for input from people. And I think you actually suggested that we talk about the history of architecture publishing. Is that right?
Yeah, a little bit. This is just, I was looking for random topics. I'd been interested in the history for a while. So right in the beginning of Bowerbird, when we were doing research and publications, we actually put in the established date for publications. So years and years ago, we were looking at it just out of pure interest. It had no real purpose. Anyway, that sparked this idea of, oh, maybe we can do a deep dive into this. And then during the week, OpenAI releases their deep research tool. And sorry, Jolien, listening at home, we've already talking about AI. Come back in a minute or so. But I put it into this AI to do a deep dive, which means the AI will spend 10 minutes researching a topic. And it came back with a 7,000 page report. I was like, wow, this is awesome. But that basically allows us to talk about it throughout the podcast.
Yeah.
So
Nick sends me 7,000 pages of information to review before our podcast today. I immediately went, okay, I'm going to throw this into Google's Notebook LM tool, which basically allows you to create a podcast of two people talking about whatever the content is that you add. And so it created this quick 20-minute podcast, and that's what we're going to play for you now. We're out of here. See you later.
because it's way better than us talking about it. But
well, actually, maybe it did make me think, though, like so much of podcasting is about the personalities of the people behind it. And not to say that AI can't develop those personalities, but right now, listening to it was not as engaging as listening to us, the guys on the Vergecast or Nick and Ben are the funniest guys ever to grace the airwaves.
Yeah, the automatic podcast was a little bit generic. The voices were, they sound like real people, but maybe slightly annoying people. And they
just a little too upbeat, maybe you would say.
Yeah.
Just enjoying it a little bit too much.
So we're going to go through some of the history. Also, I did another deep research, so I sent Ben another 7,000 words, which was on how architectural photography influenced publishing, but also architecture. And then we just kept asking AI questions about different architects. So we'll cover some of the big names to see how publishing had influenced their careers. Because once you tie all that together, what I found fascinating is it kind of gives you an insight into what comes next, because this stuff sort of loops and the technology triggers the next wave. So how far back do you want to go?
The 1400s, please.
Which is, I think, 1400s, 1500s, you have the invention of the printing press. And before then, you don't have anything being mass-produced in paper. Everything has to be handwritten. And the printing press triggers books like Vitruvius's famous architecture book to be republished en masse. So nothing really happens for several hundred years until you hit the 19th century. It's not until about what we might call as a journal or something printed around architecture. And that's actually the builders beat the architects to this. They're actually doing things like pattern books, documenting, I guess, how they're building and what they're doing.
So that was coming from the builders, not from the architects themselves.
I think when I first looked, the original magazine journal that you could associate with buildings came from builders.
And do you know when that was?
I think it was, I'm guessing, 1870, 1880, something like that. Because you've got a couple technologies which have come about, which is, I think printing had changed in the 1800s, and then you had the invention of the camera, or what we call the invention of the camera, becoming mainstream in that period. But they couldn't reproduce photos at that point, so it was largely text and it was largely drawings. So it might be at the time patents. I assume that means plans and details and so forth. It was
so I
also
wonder what
really
that was.
expensive.
I wonder when that. Like, I'm just trying to place that in. Like, what era were they building houses to patents?
This would have been, I guess, the Victorian era. So we haven't hit the 1900s yet. So we haven't hit modernism. We just start to see journals come out, but they're coming out of Institute of Architects, all these large organizations. So you see things like REBA, the Australian Institute of Architects with Architecture Australia. We see, Architecture Record, Architecture Journal coming out of the US. That is the original publication. And it's still largely text-based because this is around, let's say, 1890, end of that 19th century. So the discourse is very different to what we think of as a magazine. It's really an institute who is talking about architectural ideas.
Yeah, there are still journals that are out there today.
Yeah. What's interesting is when we go through this history, one of the thoughts I had was it's amazing that they still exist because you have these eras of what people were doing, and people like the idea of what those journals were doing, which is essentially debate between architects, but they're really just subsidized publications. They don't have that mainstream sort of clout that, most people come across architecture via Instagram today, not Architecture Australia or another journal that's written in an academic way. So you only have a handful of publications at the end of the 19th century, maybe one in each country. It's probably quite expensive, which is why you needed an organization to make them, because it was too hard for individuals and there probably wasn't a market.
Was it like crowdsourcing the early version? Like, because I assume that those institutes and those organizations had dues that were paid. I mean, I guess unless it was a university publication or something, but even then, you're getting funding to produce this journal based on, were there subscriptions or what was the funding model back then?
I don't know, but it would have been before advertising and it was before subscriptions. So the New York Times invents subscriptions, which we might cover a little bit later, but you don't see really any progress in publications for decades. You do see some change, like what they're printing. So suddenly you could reproduce images. You have cameras were working for architecture in the early days because you could put it on a tripod, even the big old ones, and the subject wasn't moving. So architecture worked quite well. And the French actually in 1850 or 1850s, we'll just use vague terms. By the way, none of our dates are 100% accurate. Also, the information here has come from AI, so treat it as more of a general conversation. But the French government sent out all these photographers to document the buildings, because before then, all of architecture was just people drawing, like all the sketches that you see people doing for hobbies now. That would have been the documentation of what culture and what historical monuments would have looked like. So the photo was this way of recording really important things with high accuracy.
So we're sort of getting up to the 1900s and we've got professional discourse, debate, the real sort of journal stuff. And then we're starting to head into documentation of as much as we can. So, or like documentation of the significant architecture that's out there. So media is still probably not as big a thing within architecture as documentation, professional discourse.
Not at all. It's very dry still. And it's not until you get to somebody like Le Corbusier, who then he's actively involved in publishing. He had his own publication for several years, which I didn't realize. So for about 5 years there, he also wrote several books. If you've ever read them, the writing is horrible. But
is it ArchiSpeak? Is it the early version of ArchiSpeak?
I wouldn't even call it ArchiSpeak. It's something else. It's like somebody who is trying to write a book. That's my memory. I haven't read it for 20 years, but I do remember reading it just going, I get your ideas, but the way it's written it's not.
Is he French?
Yeah.
Was he French? Yeah. So it was probably a translation as well. Yeah.
So maybe lost in translation.
Maybe in the French it's beautiful. maybe it makes you cry in French.
Well, what was happening then was it was the first time that media was seen as a movement. So you had a modernist movement. So Le Corbusier was very much about modernizing architecture, about redesigning cities, and he had to get his ideas out into the world for them to get mainstream adoption. This is a theme that keeps coming up on a lot of these large architects who benefited from media. They're talking about their work before it's been built. A lot of media now is we're documenting what has been built, but anybody who breaks the mold and sort of escalates really quickly seems to put an idea out into the world which is crazy or whimsical or something that doesn't exist, but it gets a lot of media coverage, and that triggers the work to flow into their practices and allows them to do their ideas.
That's really fascinating, actually, because that follows successful businesses of all types, that essentially everything is a prototype. When you're starting in a new area, so you're starting something new, think about Silicon Valley, think about any business really that's new. You're putting an idea out there, it's getting traction, and that's what allows you to raise funding or get support. Makes sense.
The idea is the minimum viable product. It's literally, here is an idea of how I think the world should be built or what I wanted to design. Do people support me in that? And if they do, then I guess you start to get real projects and you start that flywheel. Without that, the architect is just sat in their bedroom waiting for somebody to knock on the door to give them a job that they don't know exists. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So media was this opportunity to actually share ideas with the general public for the first time, and also share images, which previously the general public probably didn't see architecture except for train stations or courthouses or churches. It would have been the main monuments rather than the idea of you might use an architect for a house. I don't think that would have been mainstream at that time.
So what was the next big milestone in architecture media, do you think?
Well, I think there's an era here which is interesting, which is when photos can be reproduced. So I think somewhere in the early 20th century, printing changes, and now you're taking photos, but at that time you take a photo and maybe you could put it up on a wall, but to mass produce it so that you can get it out to the masses didn't really exist. So you're starting to see, I'm guessing here, but let's say 1920s, you start to see a lot more of this. I think the Leica is a very compact 35mm camera. I think that was invented somewhere between 1920 and 1925. So suddenly you could move the camera with a lot less weight. But what I found really interesting is at that time, it was all black and white film, and that influenced architecture in a black and white way.
So media was actually influencing the creation of the architecture, the ideas of architecture. Is that what you're suggesting in 1920?
In 1920, yeah, 100%. So the way, from what I can read here, what was happening is architects had realized that media did have an impact, and some buildings looked better in a photo, and the projects that look better in a photo obviously would attract more clients. Now, for anyone who's not into black and white photography as much as I am, because that's what I predominantly shoot in, if I'm not shooting architecture, it's all black and white. I just love it. It's really high contrast, and you're normally shooting when you've got lots of light. It's very different to how people photograph today when, especially with buildings, everything is a twilight shot. You're trying to soften the light. In black and white, you're trying to get these striking lines, which you think about modernist architecture being full of concrete and these shadows, and Le Corbusier's work, if you've ever visited those buildings, they really are quite striking. And I can imagine in black and white photos, they worked really well. So from the early days, the images were influencing what was being designed because there was a feedback loop where if you could get out to the masses and make something look good in print, then you probably got more exposure and more people knocking on your door.
And do you have a sense of when, or do we have a sense of when color printing started happening?
Yeah, so I looked that up this morning. Kodak, I think, is where they became famous. Color film, they had been experimenting for many years, but it wasn't until 1940 that it started to be accessible. By 1950 or 1960, everything had gone to color. So this era of black and white that era of modernist architecture, you look at it and it correlates with the film that was used in cameras.
Yeah.
Now, I then went on to ask AI about, did the color photos influence architecture? Yeah, it thinks it does, because that's when you start to see all these bright colors in the 50s and 60s pop up. You have all these vibrant pinks and blues. Because why? Because if you're an architect and you're taking a color photo of a bland concrete building, it looks bland. It doesn't look dramatic anymore. And anybody who would use color ended up with a photo which looked amazing or different or appealing. So I imagine this changed how architecture was designed all over the world.
I think the other thing that you see from that, so we're talking about 50s, 60s, post-war boom era in the US and, most Western countries, you had this money. Everyone had money to buy things. And so it was the architecture now needed to, in a way, accommodate a lot of product. So I'm just starting to think about, 60s, 70s shag pile, orange shag pile carpet and green sunken couches and, all that stuff, the iconic imagery of the 60s and 70s coming at you. And you go, surely that was a really big turning point for architectural media, where it started to move into the homemaker sphere as well. This wasn't just architecture as a standalone thing. It was, okay, we now have interiors photography that includes some pretty out there product as well.
Yeah. The other correlation is probably the rise of human population and the size of cities, which makes sense because you have more buildings, you have more things to talk about. Just if you're not building anything, you're not going to have active architecture magazines. So you do have those correlations there. The other interesting thing about the product in the mainstream is you're involving more people in the conversation now. So more people can feel like, I've got a home and I want that home to be special or different. How do I do that? And then I guess the architects are the aspirational designers who only the rich and famous can really afford. But everybody's now being dragged into that conversation.
Well, and that's around about the time, like when you have something like that where architecture, even just going back to the early days of architectural publishing, it was often individual supporters, individuals who had lots of money. Like I'm sure in the UK, there would have been
Patrons.
a prince or patrons, people who just gave money to it. And then as you get through into the 20th century, you're talking about patrons of architecture are the ones who are commissioning it. They may not be, directly paying for the publications anymore, but they are the ones creating it. And then there was that oppositional force to that, which is, hang on, architecture is now becoming only for the wealthy. And you have the architects who are saying, no, design and architecture should be for the masses. And I guess that's when you start to come back into more pattern book stuff. Because here in Australia, we had you'll tell me exactly what it's called. I've forgotten what it's called.
Yeah, you had you had all the plans that architects were sort of selling off I think it was to do with Robin Boyd as well. I think he was involved with it.
Yeah, but it had a name. I think the Institute was as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's an organization that still technically does it. Maybe it closed down recently. But yeah, you do see this change and the ability to communicate to a lot more people. So just going back a little bit, when you mentioned patrons, in the beginning, there was no economy around publishing. So at least in magazines. So it really was funded by patrons. And if you jump over to newspapers, the newspapers, you think of the newspaper barons of that era, you don't have radio. So radio was invented it became big between 1920 and 1930. That's when you see this massive rise of radio, and you have War of the Worlds as a big radio show. In the US, you have 600 radio stations emerge in that era. And then by the end of the they've all been condensed down and bought out. And then it shifts over into movies in the 1930s and 1940s. And then eventually you end up with this dominant period of TV. So you have these overlapping eras. Before that, newspapers were the king of media. That was where everything was happening. But all of those newspapers were financed by selling them on the corner street. So, you see those movies with the kids,
Extra, read all about it.
Those kids, perfect. And that's where you ended up with a lot of headlines, like scandalous headlines. I think they used to call the newspapers something like the yellow papers or something, because they were printed on this. It wasn't a white paper. It was like a cheaper paper or something. But all the headlines were scandalous. They were clickbait back in the day, because if you could convince somebody to stop on the street and buy your newspaper, you would sell more. And it wasn't until the New York Times came along, and I think this happened maybe in the 1930s. They introduced subscriptions to the newspaper, and it meant they could write content over, let's say, a month, because that's just subscription time. And they had to make sure that the reader was engaged for the entire time, not just the single headline. Yeah. Did you look up the?
Well, no, I was sorry. I'm sitting here with Google's Notebook LM in front of me. I've inputted all of your data, and I'm just asking questions to see how good it is. Right? Again, haven't verified this. This is not good journalism, but it's giving some really interesting information and interesting talking points. But I think where that comes to with subscriptions is it allowed for the rise of the architecture critic, because prior to that, salacious headlines were what made you money. Well, now you've got these people, or really we're talking about the elite class, the people who are able to read and do all of those things. So New York Times, their first full-time architecture critic, so that was the first full-time architecture critic at any major newspaper, according to our friends in AI, was 1963, New York Times. So that, I assume, that gave rise to the next generation of architecture critics, I guess, the mainstream architecture critic.
My guess is there's a really clear era somewhere in the 1960s where you have the architecture critic, because it doesn't exist in the same way anymore. You might have one or two people who talk about architecture within a large city, but it's not the same way that I think it used to be. I think the critic in the 60s was a public discourse. It was really taking architecture out to the masses and talking about how we design cities, and probably had a lot of change there with modernism coming in with a lot of highways and freeways and rethinking how cities were built. But yeah, my guess is that was just like a window of time, which then sort of got relegated back into the journals. Because if you look at critique now, you might find it in a journal like Architecture Australia, but even if it's really critique anymore, because it's hard to talk about an architect's work if you need the architect's support to get your next story. So it's fascinating
to be able to critique something without fear or favor. I think that's what's really interesting overall in media. So bringing my knowledge to the idea of journalism, the idea of not being biased is really something we struggled with in my lifetime. Bias doesn't mean giving equal weight to good things and bad things. Balance doesn't mean giving both views equal weighting, right? And I think that's what happens with a lot of architectural journals nowadays. You can say some bad things as long as you say really good things as well, for the exact reason that you were talking about. You can't just bag out a piece of architecture unless everyone in the industry hates that architect. You can't actually do that. So that's probably where we've gotten to. You have to always say, look, it's good in these ways and it's, not so good in these ways. There we go. We've given you a balanced view. Whereas the architecture critics of newspapers, they didn't owe anything to anyone other than their readers. And that was proper journalism. And I would say if you looked at North America, where a lot of this criticism started, or critics within newspapers started, I reckon you could count the number of actual architecture critics. I don't think any of them would be full-time anymore. Maybe there's still one or two, but I reckon you could count them on one hand. These actual architecture critics, it's just gone, essentially.
Yeah, so it's interesting seeing the eras. So you have eras of the publishing and how things rise. Things don't ever seem to die completely. So things like radio has never really died. It's just not as dominant. I assume the same thing with the critics. It's like you might have one person who writes an article once a year. It can never really die, but it just lingers for a long time. So coming back to this timeline, we put in dates and to see when publications were being established. And what you see is you basically have this chart, which for the 20th century goes like this. And then at around 1980, it just jumps. So in that middle time, the only thing that's been invented is magazines like Domus. You can probably count one magazine every decade. There's just very little movement. And you imagine part of it would have been really hard. The world's not international at that point because you can't get access to the buildings unless you go there and you travel, and that's really expensive. You just have this interesting period where technically you have magazines, but nothing's happening until you hit 1978. And the big shift is desktop publishing. So you have the introduction of computers, and now you can lay out magazines, on a computer. And I think the cost of printing drastically drops. And that's where you see the rise of what we think of as architecture magazines. So that would be things like Houses magazines in Australia, Azura magazine over in Canada. These are nationally based magazines. We still haven't hit an international level because people can't get access to stuff. Let's say you are based in one city. Trying to find architectural stories around a country would have been very difficult at that point because you've got no internet. You don't have that technology.
Well, and perhaps more significantly, the photographs were still sent as the negatives. You had physical photographs. You need to ship them. I don't know much about photography, but I'm pretty sure the 35 large format film was huge slides, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what happened would, you'd have to make a reproduction and then send that person a reproduction,
which costs money.
And that's when you had all the licensing fees for magazines to use the photos, and there's a lot of work that's involved with it. So, and I think then there was a change in printing as well. The printing, you end up with a lot of glossy mags. Glossy mags never existed until that was made possible. And so you just have this whole era which goes all the way through the 80s up until about mid-90s. And then you end up with the emergence of the internet. So
which didn't have much of an impact on anything at all, really, did it?
No, it's nothing. It's like, it's never going to take on.
Never.
It's just like AI. It's just like a fad.
It's a fad, absolutely, yeah.
And I'm trying to remember the first online publication that came out. I think it's either Design or Design Boom. Design Boom, 1999.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because they advertised that on their website, I think. So.
In those magazines in the 1980s, you've got Elle Decor, you've got Architecture Today, you've got Fast Code Design, you've got Wallpaper Magazine, you've got Mark Magazine. All of this is 1995, 1997, Frame Magazine in 1997, and then you hit 1999, and then the game changes. Everything is online. Design Boom, eArchitect, Dwell, Tree Hugger, Architectonic, the Architect's Newspaper. You keep going until, well, interestingly, the big ones, Arc Daily doesn't come along until 2008.
I think wasn't Design around 2008 as well?
Yeah, Design was 2006.
2006, yeah.
Design Milk is 2006. We've got Architizer in 2009. So yeah, you've got a lot happening in that period. That web era goes from about 1989 until 2000, it starts in 1999 and goes until 2012 when Instagram kicks in.
You know what's fascinating? Just something popped into my head then was, when was WordPress created? WordPress was created in 2003. So you think about the boom of those websites, and I would be very surprised if they were, or the early ones weren't all built on WordPress.
Yeah, or some similar open source sort of tools. Yeah, you're right. So it's access to the internet. So in that era, the other thing you've got is the emergence of digital cameras, which, from memory, I don't think digital cameras were really coming online until, well, I had my first digital camera in 2008. So maybe a few years before that, let's say in the 2000s, they were coming about. and the resolution was getting high enough that you could use them for print publications. But what it meant was you could now see these projects on the other side of the world. So you could go find them. You had email, and then you had ways of transferring large files like images. So that was when architectural publishing became international.
What happened alongside that is another shift in the funding model. So when you go from print to digital, so print, I guess we haven't really sort of delved into it, but we went from wealthy benefactors who just supported things, or organizations which subsidized architectural publications, through to magazines that had advertising, which was, again, was probably the 60s, 50s, 60s, when you started to see a lot more sort of a crossover with homemaker magazines, home magazines. And then obviously once you get into the digital era, advertising, there was a lot more of it, because you had bigger audiences and you could sell ads that ran for a day instead of an ad that ran in a quarterly publication. So all of a sudden, the supply and demand for advertising moved into this whole new realm.
We had the introduction of Google and all of their ads. So a lot of these early websites, they would just add a little bit of code for Google, and Google would run all the ads for them. And they would just take their pennies as it would come through. That internet era is really the era of copy and paste. So very cheap journalism at large scale. And again, you end up with headlines and clickbait. Not so much in architecture. Architecture seems to be less clickbaity, but internet as a whole is a lot like those early newspapers, where they're just trying to get your attention so that you click, because if you click, they make money.
You see ads. Yeah.
You see ads. So all of that's going through until, my guess is around 2012, when Instagram takes off in architecture. So the architects miss Twitter because it's all word-based. It doesn't resonate. Then you hit Instagram. Everybody's getting things photographed. They have images. And if you count Instagram channels as publications, the spike just goes through the roof, because now everyone can be a publisher.
I think what was fascinating about Instagram for architects, Instagram launched in 2010. Usually it takes a couple of years for it to get out of the US. That just tended to be what happened back then. Instagram initially was all about filters. It was about taking really terrible iPhone photos, putting a filter on them and making it look artistic. The interesting thing about architectural photography is it's always been an art. It's always been incredibly high quality, incredibly expensive, relatively expensive content to produce. So the fact that in 2012, they start to go, wait a second, there's an image-based platform here, and we have the best images of anyone outside of maybe advertisers, as in, product advertisers, product photography. And so it was just the perfect place for architecture to explode.
Yeah, it was the Instagram became the distributor of this content. The content was just sitting there waiting to be used. We forgot one important date, which was in 2014. These two guys made this dodgy website called bowerbird.io.
It's a lie. It was actually called Media Map.
It's Media Map back then.
But glad we changed that name.
But you can see what happened was we had this explosion of publications, and then there was too many publications to manage. We moved from that era where there was one magazine, and if you knew the editor, then you had all the exposure, to there's hundreds of publications, and now I can't manage it all. It's just, there's too much back and forth with all these editors. They're asking for the same thing. I'm spending my life for what seems like this low value website. And so that's when the idea of aggregating the value of those websites, and the idea of, virality. Virality didn't exist until you had enough publications to see something become viral. And that's, yeah.
I was running a website. I was running an interior design website in 2008 at InDesign Live, and then launching Habitus Living as well around that same time. So I was part of this movement at that time, not that you know it. And the interesting thing about the virality was, as an editor, this is why you and I sort of clicked and jumped on and started creating Bowerbird. I found it really hard to find content. What you would do is, because there were one or two websites that people were actually actively submitting to, I would say ArcDaily, Design Boom, and Dezeen at that stage would be the ones that I would go to each day to see if there was a project in Australia that I could then go and reach out to the architect and say, hey, can we publish this thing? We always did it the right way, but yeah, that's how something became viral, because you only had one source to find a lot of this stuff.
This is called the New York Times effect. What was happening there, where one publication breaks a story, and then you have a whole series of secondary publications which copy it. So this was happening with newspapers. So the New York Times would break a story, and then all the regional newspapers would use the New York Times as the source material and report that the New York Times reports that such and such has happened.
So as long as the New York Times was bigger than your publication, you could sort of mention it in the article.
Yeah, so I guess you need a quantity of publications for virality to occur, for movement to jump from one publication to the next. So that's sort of this rough outline of that history. Then I was curious about the impact that publishing had on architects, and it kind of sparked some really interesting questions. I first asked it about Frank Lloyd Wright, because I've always had this suspicion that Frank Lloyd Wright is probably the most famous architect of all time in history. And surely that is only possible if there's a way for people to find out about Frank Lloyd Wright. It's got to have something to do with media. And so it's talking about, yes, he was covered. He gained national and international attention through architecture magazines such as Architectural Record, The Western Architect, and House Beautiful in the early 1900s. So he was early. So he was one of the first people ever. But here's a really interesting one: is the architectural journal, the Wasmuth Portfolio, which was established in 1910, was influential in introducing Wright's work to a European audience. So this was a German publication.
Because Wright was American, was he? Is that right?
He was American, Chicago-based.
Yep.
This is a clear example of how media moves architecture across borders and how architects get work outside of where they currently are. So any of these super famous architects, they're not limited. Their reach is getting really, really broad, and their projects are now starting to happen all over the world. That's only because media is taking their ideas out to people in distant places.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how it changes. Again, that the publishing being about discourse in the very early days, and debate and all of that stuff. All of a sudden, you've got these amazing images coming from the other side of the world. How is that not going to impact the way you practice as an architect where you are?
And when you're thinking about a movement where you're transforming the way you live and you're grappling with these new problems, because we didn't have cities that were that large then. This was the first time that we had this massive population group somewhere. So people being able to talk about how do you deal with that? And you would have had thought, essentially this is the early thought leaders going out in these sorts of publications.
The fascinating thing is the photography and the iconography of that architectural photography. You think about Lloyd Wright and Falling Water. Everyone knows that. I mean, the mainstream throughput of that image, everyone could recognize it, even if they can't necessarily name the project. And you go, wow, the power of imagery to create a brand for an architect. He must have been the first, really.
Yeah, and it still is probably one of the most recognized buildings of all time. So I sort of went through when I was wondering, well, I wonder what was happening with Le Corbusier then. Because, you have Frank Lloyd Wright, and then you have Le Corbusier. Is there a parallel here?
So were they contemporaries? What?
They must have been very close. So the Le Corbusier is here. He's writing toward a new architecture in 1923. So maybe he was a little bit later than Frank Lloyd Wright. But they were part of that, I guess, that transition into modernism, and then obviously Le Corbusier was very much modernist.
They were almost exactly contemporaries. They were born and died very close together.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, and he's based in France. And so this is where it gets interesting.
He was born in Switzerland.
Sorry.
Lived it, but it's Swiss French.
People, like we said before, fact check everything we say.
Well, hang on. I'm just using Google. Don't trust anything.
So he writes his own book. He writes a manifesto that argued that a radical break from traditional architecture, promoting machine aesthetics, functionalism, and new materials like concrete. So he's really breaking the mold, and he's using publishing as a way to get those ideas out into the world. And then I think magazines, he founded a magazine, L'Esprit Nouveau, 1920 to 1925. And that disseminated modernist ideas in architecture. And his work was widely published in journals like Architectural Record, Domus, and L'Architecture very French. And so again, he was getting published there. And then there's something about the photography again, black and white photos, because again, his work, you can just see it now. It makes so much sense. That style, if you want to photograph black and white buildings, which ones do you photograph? Interestingly, trying to photograph things in black and white now, the buildings don't really shine in the same way. Like you're looking for a big monolithic concrete block.
Yeah, it's hard to photograph contemporary architecture with black and white and get that same impact for sure.
Then jumping forward a little bit. So there's a couple people here. Frank Gehry, I looked into very briefly. He did mention the importance of media, because he basically said without media, there is no public conversation. So if you don't have a functioning set of magazines or newspapers, then people just will not discuss architecture, and there's no conversation. It just disappears. So we're getting a little bit closer to present day. And so if you look at Barge Ingalls and Big, I don't know if people know the history of how he started, but he wrote this comic book. It was a graphic novel manifesto.
What's it called?
More.
That's right. Yes, it's more.
Breakthrough in architectural publishing. Instead of a dense academic text, the book presents his firm's philosophy in comic book form, making it accessible to a broad audience.
It's probably that might be a little bit of overstatement there. I'm thinking like you've got comic book nerds and architects. It's really just two. It's a different group of very specific people.
What a Venn diagram.
He's obviously in it. He's obviously smack bang in the middle. I bet you he grew up with comic books and that's why he did this.
It embodies his pragmatic utopianism, an optimistic, playful approach to architecture that embraces constraints rather than resisting them. So the theme I'm getting with all of this is these really large architects started off with an idea before the building, promoted that idea out into the world, and then use media to basically grow their audience and people recognizing what their work is. So thinking about architects who say things like, I've got enough work coming through my door, when they go, I don't really think about media, but do you think about your career? Because it's really evident. There's a very clear correlation here that if you want to get more people on board with what you're doing, you're going to have to tell more people. Barge Ingalls is that he started to go multi-platform. So before this era, people would think about publishing like you get published in a magazine, it's all print. But what made him different is he was often featured in Arc Daily, Design Boom, lots of places like that. But then also things like TED Talks and video media. So this is the emergence of, it's not about a single platform anymore. It's about being everywhere.
All the time.
Yeah, everywhere all the time, which probably leads us into try to speculating about the future and what that actually means and the impact.
The other thing is that he's on a Netflix show. Like Netflix is this cultural icon, right? He's in the zeitgeist. When you look at those case studies of the architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, being in the place where everyone is really important. I think the interesting thing that I just want to draw through it as well, like that idea, I think a lot of architects nowadays kind of push away from this idea of I have a brand, I have a personal brand, or a practice has a brand. They don't want to embrace that. But you look at the most successful architects, Frank Lloyd Wright might not have used those words, but he was creating a brand and he knew what he was doing and he was doing it for a reason. It's okay to have a brand. You don't have to be afraid of having a brand because that's the vehicle that allows you to do these awesome things. Like Bjarke Ingels, he's now got a vehicle to create any number of amazing buildings that have social impact and all of those things.
Yeah. And if you were at university today, imagine you have a hero. You look up to the architects above you and saying, how can I go in that direction? If you're only thinking about the building, you will never make it. That's evident to me. In your mind, if you're planning out your career and you're saying, I want to be one of the best architects in the world, really it's about what is the idea you have and how are you going to communicate that to the world? Because you're going to need the support from the world to make those things happen. And that just doesn't get taught in university at all. It's always about just do the work, make a good product, and everybody
The rest will
find
follow.
you, which is a complete nonsense. It doesn't work like that at all.
It's the myth of word of mouth as well. And we hear this all the time, architects coming and saying, I get all my work through word of mouth. Word of mouth is incredibly powerful. No doubt. Someone saying, hey, go and use this architect, really good. But anyone who gets any sort of recommendation from a friend nowadays knows that they also jump onto Google, they're jumping onto Instagram. And because architecture, the engagement with architecture takes such a long time, that person is probably considering 5 other architects, even though their friend recommended them. And if all you're doing is going, oh, that was a recommendation, and you're not doing any other promotion of your business, how many recommendations are you missing out on because you're not doing the other work that goes with that?
Well, yeah, it's about top of funnel. If you can increase the number of people who come into contact with you and your ideas, then you can cherry pick the best person who matches what you're trying to do, whether that's you're trying to improve the quality of the work you're doing or how much you're getting paid for that work. They both correlate. Ironically, doing the stuff you love often means you're going to get paid more because the person has higher drive to use you because they come into contact with you. You have a better reputation. In their minds, you're more valuable.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if big architects aren't the most expensive quote for every tender. I would genuinely be surprised, and they're winning work even though they'll be the most expensive.
Well, you think about like any of the star architects. So let's say Zaha Hadid in that peak period, cities were getting proposals from Zaha Hadid. And part of that calculation would have been, is getting this big name architect building something in this city going to be increase the brand
reputation,
of that city?
Yeah, the brand of the
reputation. City. So you had that happen with like Renzo Piano building in Sydney. Well, obviously you had this over in Spain a lot with Bilbao and Valencia. So that was with Santiago Calatrava. So there was a period where their value was really high because they were really well known. Again, where does that come from? It's because their images and their stories have been disseminated out into the world at a high level.
That happens on a micro scale as well. Like the most famous architect in your suburb being the most well-known architect in your suburb is going to be valuable. You may not want to be a Bjarke Ingels, you may not want to be super famous, but if you are the most famous in your context, then basically you're going to get more people knocking on your door.
Yep, you want to, in your niche, you have that niche and you excel really well in that niche, you end up increasing the number of people walking through your door and wanting to work with you, rather than you sitting there waiting and then starving and then making bad decisions because you don't have enough clients to choose from. We're speculating here from the history and some of these big names, but I'm 100% confident that if you are getting published a lot and telling stories and you have a clear idea of what you do, you're going to have a lot more work than the architect who doesn't do that.
And so I suppose maybe to sort of wrap the conversation a bit, what is the future? Did our deep dive into all of this stuff reveal what might be coming in the future? Is it any good at predicting the future? Can AI predict the future?
I didn't ask it, but here's my speculation on some of this. I think what we've seen is you have this sort of fragmentation of topics. So you end up with these big mainstream ones like building or architecture, and then it becomes a bit more mainstream. And then you get down to houses or landscape architecture in the 80s. And then you hit all the websites and suddenly you've got sustainability websites. You've got specialities that are coming out. And by the time you hit Instagram, now you've got all sorts of niche topics. And I think we're still going through that phase, like tiny homes, just a niche that wouldn't have existed in the 90s, at the scale that it does now. My guess is we'll have lots of those niches.
I think we've touched on this before, but to me, the most fundamental change is AI. And I think what we have now that we haven't had before, so before AI became mainstream, it was really hard to tell niche stories. It was hard to find that information. It was hard to interview people and get those really interesting niche stories. Now with AI, it's able to, that's what we're working on, tools to do this, to be able to interview people that were maybe focused on, the cabinetry or, any number of these tiny little stories, which are actually big stories of their own. So I think that's where the potential comes from AI, is that we've moved past this copy and paste era. Anyone who's still doing copy and paste is probably, if they don't address it, they will be left behind. And that next era is those small niche, if not niche publications, much better quality niche topics within publications. They're going to be better, more engaging stories.
Yeah, more detail. Like you look at what we've just done with a deep research using AI, the amount of information that we were able to pull out of a 10-minute query to be able to talk about it, the conversation has to get more in depth, has to have more detail. I'm optimistic about the future of publications.
And the other thing is the funding model starts to change. We've never really been in this position where we're able to get a product supplier who can advertise directly against a niche piece of content. I think that's going to be fascinating, where even if that piece of content only gets 10 views from 10 highly engaged customers, that's so much more valuable than running a Google ad that gets 1,000 views and maybe you hit one. So I think that's interesting as well. If publishers aren't looking at the power to tie advertising or get better quality advertising, and I think that's where Google will be an interesting one to watch to see if they get better at that. But again, AI has the potential to change all of these things and help architectural publishing to thrive.
Well, folks, I think we're coming up to our hour mark. So thank you for listening. And like always, if you've got questions, feel free to put questions underneath this YouTube, or if you see it on LinkedIn or other social platforms.
Or if you find something we get wrong, correct us.
Yeah, we love that. We want to have these conversations to be more open. So please join in and let us know what you think. Cool.
Goodbye, Bellbirders.
Bye.